The question is as follows. Mr. Poilievre, seconded by Mr. McColman, moved that given A, the Liberal election platform states that government and its information should be open by default, and data paid for by Canadians belongs to Canadians. B, the Department of Finance has indicated that a federally mandated carbon tax will cause higher prices to cascade through the economy in the form of higher prices. C, such regressive taxes cause low-income people to bear a larger burden as heat, gas, and groceries form a larger portion of their family budgets. And D, the Department of Finance has produced numerous calculations of the impact of these taxes on low and middle-income families and their effect on the gap between rich and poor. An order of the House do issue for a copy of the Department of Finance's documents titled Impact of a Carbon Price on Households' Consumption Costs Across the Income Distribution and Estimating Economic Impacts from Various Mitigation Options for Greenhouse Gas Emissions, and any other documents that calculate the cost of carbon taxes on Canadian workers, businesses, and families. All those in favour of the motion will please rise.
Ms. Ambrose.
Ms. Ambrose.
Mr. Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson.
Ms. Finley.
Ms. Finley.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Ritz.
Mr. Anderson.
Mr. Anderson.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. Block.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mrs. McLeod, Kamloops, Thompson, Caribou.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Clement.
Mr. Deltel.
Mr. Deltel.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Bergen.
Ms. Watts.
Ms. Watts.
Mr. Kent.
Mr. Kent.
Ms. Rampel.
Ms. Rampel.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Fast.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Poilievre.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Van Loan.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Tilson.
Mr. Warwa.
Mr. Warwa.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Carey.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Reid.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Workington.
Mr. Brown.
Mr. Brown.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mrs. Vecchio.
Mr. Abultaïf.
Mr. Abultaïf.
Mrs. Wong.
Mrs. Wong.
Ms. Gladue.
Ms. Gladue.
Mr. McColman.
Mr. McColman.
Mr. Reyes.
Mr. Reyes.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Brassard.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lake.
Mr. Lauzon, Stormont, South
Mr.
Glengarry.
Lozon, Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Lukiski.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Albrecht.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Van Kesteren.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. Dreeshen.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. McKenzie.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Sweet.
Mr. Lobb.
Mr. Law.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Généreux.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Gould.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Richards.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Hoback.
Mr. Sopak.
Mr. Sopak.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Stanton.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Zimmer.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. Falk.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. McGuire.
Mr. Barlow.
Mr.
Mr.
Barlow.
Urdega.
Mr. Urdega.
Mr. Eglinski.
Mr. Eglinski.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Arnold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Berthold.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Cooper.
Mr. Diot.
Mr. Diot.
Mr. Janis.
Mr. Janis.
Mr. Genereux.
Mr. General.
Ms. Harder.
Ms. Harder.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Godin.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kitchen.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Kimmich.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Macaulay, Edmonton West.
Mr. Leipert.
Mr. Leipert.
Ms. Leach.
Ms. Leach.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Nader.
Mr. Soroya.
Mr. Soroya.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Schmale.
Mr. Shields.
Mr. Shields.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Stubbs.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mrs. Wagenthal.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Waugh.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Weber.
Mr. Motts.
Mr. Mott.
Ms. Raitt.
Ms. Raitt.
Mr. Trost.
Mr. Trost.
All those opposed to the motion will please rise.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Monsieur Trudeau.
Mr. Hare.
Mr. Hare.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Ms. Qualtrough.
Mr. Sajan.
Mr. Sajan.
Mrs. Philpott.
Mrs. Philpott.
Mr. Goodale.
Mr. Goodale.
Madame Joly.
Madame Joly.
Ms. Freeland.
Ms. Freeland.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Monsieur Leblanc.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Chager.
Ms. Foote.
Ms. Foote.
Mr. Morneau.
Mr. Morneau.
Mr. Bryson.
Mr. Bryson.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould.
Ms. Wilson-Raybould.
Madame Leboutillier.
Madame Leboutillier.
Madame Bibeau.
Madame Bibeau.
Mr. Hussain.
Mr. Hussain.
Ms. McKenna.
Ms. McKenna.
Mr. Baines.
Mr. Baines.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Haidu.
Ms. Mahaichuk.
Ms. Mahaichuk.
Mr. Casey Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Casey Cumberland
Mr.
Colchester.
Easter.
Mr. Easter.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. McKay.
Mr. Nault.
Mr. Nault.
Ms. Groh.
Ms. Groh.
Mr. Hiking.
Mr. Hiking.
Mrs. Romanado.
Mrs. Romanado.
Monsieur Lauzon, Argenteuil, la Petite Nation.
Monsieur Lauzon-Argenteuil, la Petite Nation.
Monsieur Rioux.
Monsieur Rioux.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Monsieur Lightbound.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Holland.
Mr. Casey Charlottetown.
Mr. Casey Charlottetown.
Mr. Leslie.
Mr. Leslie.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Gould.
Ms. Monsef.
Ms. Monsef.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Monsieur Rodriguez.
Mr. Sohi.
Mr. Sohi.
Monsieur Garneau.
Monsieur Garneau.
Ms. Duncan Etobicoke North.
Ms. Duncan Etobicoke
Monsieur
North.
Duclos.
Monsieur Duclos.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Murray.
Ms. Kira.
Ms. Kira.
Mrs. Caesar Chavan.
Mrs. Caesar Chavan.
Monsieur Cormier.
Monsieur Cormier.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Mr. Wilkinson.
Monsieur Lemaitre.
Monsieur Lemaitre.
Mr. Cosner.
Mr. Cosner.
Ms. Jones.
Ms. Jones.
Mr. Bagnall.
Mr. Bagnall.
Monsieur Paradis.
Mr.
Mr.
Paradis.
McGinty.
Mr. McGinty.
Mr. Scarpelagia.
Mr. Scarpelagia.
Mr. Sims.
Mr. Sims.
Ms. Ratanzi.
Ms. Ratanzi.
Mr. Jesnevsky.
Mr. Jesnev.
Mr. Daliwal.
Mr. Daliwal.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Shifke.
Mr. Varani.
Mr.
Ms.
Varani.
Goldsmith-Jones.
Ms. Goldsmith-Jones.
Mr. Fillmore.
Fillmore.
Mr. Algabra.
Mr. Algabra.
Mr. De Courcy.
Mr. De Courcy.
Mr. Beach.
Mr. Beach.
Ms. Rudd.
Ms. Rudd.
Mr. Duguid.
Mr. Duguid.
Monsieur Miller, Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île des Sœurs.
Mr. Miller, Ville-Marie, le Sud-Ouest, Île des Sœurs.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. Lamoureux.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mr. McKinnon-Gatineau.
Mrs. McCrimmon,
Mrs. McCrimmon,
Ms. Petitpas-Taylor,
Ms. Petitpas-Taylor,
Mr. Vaughan, Mr. Mendicino, Mr. Blair,
Mr. Blair,
Monsieur Poisson,
Monsieur Poisson,
Ms. Hutchings,
Ms. Hutchings,
Ms. Young,
Ms. Young,
Mr. Pesky-Solido,
Mr. Pesky-Solido,
Madame Mendez,
Madame Mendez,
Mr. Oliphant,
Mr. Oliphant,
Monsieur Dubourg,
Monsieur Dubourg,
Mr. Aldaig,
Mr. Aldaig,
Mr. Amos,
Mr. Amos,
Mr. Adadasangari,
Mr. Nandasangari,
Monsieur Arsenault,
Monsieur Arsenault,
Mr. Aria,
Mr. Area,
Monsieur Ayoub,
Monsieur Ayoub,
Mr. Badaway,
Mr. Badaway,
Mr. Bayless,
Mr. Bayless,
Mr. Biddle,
Mr. Biddle,
Mr. Boissonneau,
Boissonneau,
Mr. Basio,
Mr. Bossio,
Mr. Bettina,
Mr. Bettina,
Monsieur Breton,
Monsieur Breton,
Mr. Chen,
Mr. Chen,
Ms. Labroussen,
Ms. Labroussen,
Ms. Damoff,
Ms. Damoff,
Ms. Dillon,
Ms. Dillon,
Monsieur Diorio,
Monsieur Diorio,
Monsieur Drouin,
Monsieur Drouin,
Ms. Tassi,
Ms. Tassi,
Ms. Jerowitz,
Ms. Zerowitz,
Mr. Essasti,
Mr. Essasti,
Monsieur Elkoury,
Mr. Elkoury,
Mr. Ellis,
Mr. Ellis,
Mr. Erskine
Mr.
Smith,
Erskine Smith,
Mr. Ailfson,
Mr. Ailfson,
Monsieur Fergus,
Monsieur Fergus,
Mr. Finnegan,
Mr. Finnegan,
Mr. Fonseca,
Mr. Fonseca,
Mr. Fregascatos,
Mr. Fregascatos,
Mr. Fraser West Nova,
Mr. Fraser West Nova,
Mr. Fraser Central Nova,
Mr. Fraser Central,
Mr. Greywall,
Mr. Greywall,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Hardy,
Mr. Graham,
Mr. Graham,
Mr. Harvey,
Mr. Harvey,
Mr. Housefather,
Mr. Housefather,
Monsieur Iacono,
Mr. Iacono,
Mrs. Jordan,
Mrs. Jordan,
Mr. Johari,
Mr. Johari,
Mr. Kong,
Mr. Kong,
Ms. Khalid,
Ms. Khalid,
Madame Lapointe,
Madame Lapointe,
Monsieur Lefebvre,
Monsieur Lefebvre,
Monsieur Lemieux,
Monsieur Lemieux,
Mr. Levitt,
Mr. Levitt,
Mrs. Lockhart,
Mrs. Lockhart,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Long,
Mr. Longfield,
Mr. Longfield,
Ms. Ludwig,
Ms. Ludwig,
Mr. Maloney,
Mr. Maloney,
Monsieur Massé, Avignon, la Métis, Matane, Matapédia,
Mr. Massé, Avignon, la Métis, Matane, Matapédia,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Mr. May Cambridge,
Mr. McDonald,
Mr. McDonald,
Mr. McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port
Mr.
Coquitlam,
McKinnon, Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam,
Mr. McLeod, Northwest Territories,
McLeod, Northwest Territories,
Mr. Morrissey,
Mr. Morrissey,
Madame Nassif,
Madame Nassif,
Ms. O'Connell,
Ms. O'Connell,
Mr. Oliver, Mr. O'Regan,
Mr. O'Regan,
Monsieur Ouellet,
Mr. Ouellet,
Mr. Peterson,
Mr. Peterson,
Monsieur Picard,
Mr. Picard,
Mr. Rumi,
Mr. Rumi,
Mr. Rosnack,
Mr. Rosnack,
Ms. Sahota,
Ms. Sahota,
Mr. Saini,
Mr. Saini,
Monsieur Sanson,
Mr. Sanson,
Mr. Sanga,
Mr. Sanga,
Mr. Sarai,
Mr. Sarai,
Mrs. Schultz,
Mrs. Schultz,
Monsieur Serre,
Monsieur Serre,
Madame Shanahan,
Madame Shanahan,
Mr. Sheehan,
Mr. Sheehan,
Mr. Sidhu, Mission Masquerade, Fraser
Mr.
Canyon,
Sidhu, Mission, Matsquin, Fraser Canyon,
Ms. Sidhu, Brampton
Ms.
South,
Sidhu, Brampton South,
Mr. Sikan,
Sikan,
Mr. Sorbera,
Mr. Sorbera,
Mr. Tabera,
Mr. Tabera,
Mr. Tan,
Mr. Tan,
Mr. Vandal,
Mr. Vandal,
Ms. Vandenbell,
Ms. Vandenbell,
Mr. Whalen,
Mr. Whalen,
Mrs. Zahid,
Mrs. Zahid,
Mr. Rota,
Mr. Rota,
Monsieur Mulcair,
Monsieur Mulcair,
Mr. Rankin,
Mr.
Ms.
Rankin,
Duncan Edmonton Strathcona,
Duncan Edmonton Strathcona,
Mr. Christopherson,
Mr. Christopherson,
Madame Brosseau,
Madame Brosseau,
Mr. Davies,
Mr. Davies,
Mr. Cullen,
Mr. Cullen,
Mr. Donnelly,
Mr. Donnelly,
Mr. Massey, Windsor West,
Mr. Massey, Windsor West,
Madame Boutin-Sweet,
Madame Bouteille,
Ms. Matheson,
Ms. Matheson,
Monsieur Dubé,
Monsieur Dubé,
Madame Laverdière,
Madame Laverdière,
Monsieur Dussault,
Monsieur Dussault,
Monsieur Boulris,
Monsieur
Ms.
Boulris,
Kwan,
Ms. Kwan,
Mr. Blakey,
Mr. Blakey,
Mr. Stewart,
Mr. Stewart,
Mr. Duval,
Mr. Duval,
Monsieur Aubin,
Monsieur Aubin,
Monsieur Nantel,
Monsieur Nantel,
Ms. Malcolmson,
Ms. Malcolmson,
Monsieur Saganache,
Monsieur Saganache,
Madame Quash,
Madame
Ms.
Quash,
Ramsey,
Ms. Ramsey,
Madame Sans
Madame
Souci,
Sans Souci,
Monsieur Choquette,
Monsieur Choquette,
Madame Trudel,
Madame Trudel,
Mr. Julian,
Mr. Julian,
Mr. Weir,
Mr. Weir,
Mr. Cannings,
Mr.
Mr.
Cannings,
Johns,
Mr. Johns,
Mr. McGregor,
Mr.
Ms.
McGregor,
Hardcastle,
Ms. Hardcastle,
Ms. Blaney, North Island, Powell
Ms.
River,
Blaney, North Island, Powell River,
Madame Hughes,
Madame Hughes,
Monsieur Fortin,
Monsieur Fortin,
Monsieur Plamondon,
Monsieur Plamondon,
Monsieur Sainte-Marie,
Monsieur Sainte-Marie,
Monsieur Marcil,
Monsieur Marcil,
Madame Posé,
Madame Posé,
Monsieur Thériault,
Monsieur Thériault,
Monsieur Beaulieu,
Monsieur Beaulieu,
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval,
Monsieur Barsalou-Duval,
Madame Gill,
Madame Gill,
Monsieur Bourriat,
Monsieur Boudria,
Ms. May, Saanich Gulf
Ms.
Islands,
May, Saanich Gulf Islands,
Mr. Tutu.
Mr. Tutu. Yeas pour 77, 77, nays contre 215, 215.
I declare the motion defeated.